How's it going, guys? Welcome back to Tidal Gardens. In this video, I'm going to cover my personal top 5 favorite LPS for beginners. Let's just hop right into it, starting with number 5, DUNCAN corals. So why do I like DUNCANs for beginners? To start off with, DUNCANs are pretty hardy, and I think that most of the things on this list are going to trend towards being hardier, something that's a little bit more tolerant of neglect, maybe not the perfect water chemistry, maybe not the perfect amount of flow or light. They can handle a broad range of conditions. The second thing with DUNCANs is that they can be fed. I like corals that can be fed, especially for beginners, because that gives you, again, a little bit more flexibility in terms of its husbandry. A lot of corals don't need to be fed, but if a coral starts to go south, being able to provide it nutrition on a daily basis like that could help it recover. As far as growth rate, it's pretty fast as far as large polyp stony corals go. But it's not quite like an SPS where you might start with a small frag. It turns into something 10, 15 times the size relatively quickly, and that throws off your entire balance of calcium, alkalinity, and magnesium. So real quick before we continue onto this list, large polyp stony corals are considered more hardy than SPS corals and generally more suitable for beginners. This is a kind of an oversimplification because there's plenty of examples of LPS that are more challenging to keep than just about any SPS coral, especially like when you get into non-photosynthetic LPS and stuff like that. A lot of the apparent difficulty in SPS is really isolated just a few types such as Acropora that tend to be very sensitive, and that perception of difficulty is then projected onto all the other SPS corals, and it's kind of like being guilty by association. For example, I don't think anybody thinks that Pocillopora is any more difficult than any LPS coral. One big difference between SPS and LPS that does come into play for beginners is that growth rate we just talked about and how it affects water chemistry. So for many beginning hobbyists, keeping stony corals of any kind is the first time that they've really had to pay attention to things like calcium, alkalinity, magnesium. LPS corals are a great way to ease into that world because in general they're not as fast growing as SPS. And part of the difficulty in keeping SPS is maintaining that consistent chemistry. But as these colonies grow, it becomes a dynamic process as that consumption of major and minor elements drastically increase as colonies grow. One slight downside to DUNCANs is that they don't exactly have the most variety when it comes to color. There's some that are more bluish, there's some that are more greenish, and shades in between. If you kind of like this shape, but are looking for slightly more in the way of color variation, possibly consider candy cane corals. There's a few different varieties that have like a neon green variant, there's like a pinwheel variant, there's some cobalt colored variants. Similar shape, but they don't have that tentacle extension, and they might be a little bit more difficult to feed, not much more, but a little bit more. Either one really, DUNCANs, candy canes, they make it into the number 5 slot. Number 4, ELEGANCE corals. ELEGANCE corals, I think, historically have been some of my favorite LPS. I was always drawn to them for 2 reasons. The first is that they basically look like this amazing anemone, and getting that anemone-like aesthetic in a stony coral was very desirable for me. The other thing that I always liked was the striations on the flesh of the coral. As far as their hardiness, I'd say it's pretty much middle of the road at this point. There was an issue with Indonesian ELEGANCE corals being susceptible to infection. Less of a problem now that there's kind of this Indonesian ban at the time of this video. So pretty much any new colony that's coming in from the wild is going to be Australian, which tend to be very hardy. Similar to DUNCANs, ELEGANCE corals can be fed rather easily. They eat a number of different prepared foods such as frozen mysis and krill. You can even use LPS pellets. There aren't that many color variations as far as elegances go, but occasionally you do come across a rare color morph, so that kind of has a nice collectible value. In particular, I would say about maybe 1 in every 10,000 or so will have yellow tips, and I used to have this particular colony. It was gigantic. It's probably easily 1.5 feet across, and I kind of still wish I had it, but I was made an impossibly good offer and I had to let it go. I'm always on the lookout for interesting color morphs of this, even though they are very uncommon. Moving on to number 3. This slot goes to EUPHYLLIA in general, but I'm really more focused on hammers and frog spawn and not so much torches. All 3 of them are fairly hardy, but torches tend to be a little bit less hardy than the other 2, and a little bit more susceptible to pests that you really want to avoid. For example, there's this flatworm that's kind of common on torch colonies, especially Indonesian torch colonies. You would think you can spot these on the coral fairly easily, but in practice that's not the case. They are masters of disguise. They can hide in plain sight. Dipping doesn't really help that much. You almost have to like constantly scrub the coral with a toothbrush along its base, knock off any eggs consistently for like a long time to really eradicate the issue, and I haven't found anything that eats them. In comparison, hammers and frog spawn don't have that type of pest issue. There are some, I guess, general LPS pests that might afflict hammers and frog spawn, but they're not quite so resilient. A couple of dips, it's no big deal. The one thing to watch out for with dealing with EUPHYLLIA, especially for beginners, is that they don't necessarily grow super fast. Some add additional heads, and that's a nice thing. However, the extension that they're capable of is sometimes underestimated by people just starting into LPS. They send out what are called sweeper tentacles, which can go out in some cases nearly like 6 inches to 1 foot away. And if you have a smaller aquarium with other possibly delicate species, and then you throw like a hammer, torch, or frog spawn in there, you do have to like be careful about coral regression because these guys are built for it. Luckily, they don't have the most potent sting, but the constant stinging and the constant range of that sting could be an issue, so watch out for that. Okay, moving on again. Let's talk about the number 2 spot, and that for me is FAVIA and FAVITES. I throw those 2 in together because really, when it comes to coral taxonomy, I'm not exactly the best. A lot of times you'll see the same coral referred to both as a FAVIA and later on by some other group as a FAVITES. Practically speaking, it doesn't make that much of a difference. I don't think the care requirements for one versus the other are going to make any difference in how you're going to take care of it. The thing I like about FAVIA and FAVITES is that they are pretty hardy corals. They also can be propagated quite easily. As they grow, they add additional polyps, and they heal very well from cutting. In general, having a coral that can be propagated, I think, is very beginner friendly. That at least gives the beginner the opportunity to separate the coral into a number of different pieces. If something goes wrong with one particular piece, the other 2 still might survive, as opposed to something like an ELEGANCE that you really shouldn't be cutting. If that colony of ELEGANCE starts to go down, it's really just one polyp, so you're gonna lose the whole thing. Whereas like a FAVIA, if you lose like a few polyps here or there, not the end of the world, because again, the fact that you could have propagated it helps a lot. The real reason why FAVIA and FAVITES are so high on this list is that they have an incredibly expansive range of colors and patterns. It's one of those things that you can kind of grow into and really start appreciating all the various different color morphs. If there's any kind of color or even color combination that you're looking for, you could probably find it with this type of coral. Okay, so we've covered my top 4 so far. And before I get to number 1, I'm going to throw in an honorable mention. So you guys get a bonus. You can call it the top 6 if you'd like. I'm gonna throw in Scalemia and Acanthophylla. The reasons why I like Scalemia and Acanthophylla so much is that they have incredible color. They are a true showpiece. The only problem is price point and the fact that they really can't be propagated. I know some people like to say that they can cut scolies, but in practice, you cut a scolie, you get a weird shaped one, and that pretty much has eliminated all value from it. And it'll take about a decade for it to turn back into a circle. Even if you're able to cut it, have both pieces survive, you end up with two misshapen pieces. I'm just gonna go ahead and categorize that as not really something you want to be propagating. But the thing about Scoles and Acanthophylla is just how hardy they are. Acanthophylla in particular are very tough. They might not be the best choice for budget-conscious hobbyists, but if you look at the coral just on its own merits and kind of disassociate yourself from the price of this, they're outstanding choices. And finally, number 1. This has been my personal favorite LPS for quite a long time. It's the BLASTOMUSSA. BLASTOMUSSA have this aesthetic that almost looks like a rhodactis. It looks like a mushroom, but it's a stony coral. There's two varieties. There's a BLASTOMUSSA merletti and a BLASTOMUSSA wellsii. And in the past, I would always kind of say that the smaller polyped guys are the merlettis, the larger polyped guys are the wellsiis. That line is getting a little bit blurred just because you can absolutely find BLASTOMUSSA merletti that are every bit as large polyp-wise as a wellsii. Wellsiis tend to have a little bit better coloration. A lot of the more exotic color variants are going to be wellsii, but I personally have grown to like merletti quite a lot more. They are much faster growing, they're a little hardier, and there are more color variants being discovered. We somewhat recently acquired a very nice blue and red variant. We also acquired a really nice red and yellow variant. And I've never seen anything like that before in about 20-something years. Okay guys, that does it for my top 5 favorite LPS corals for beginners. I am completely sure I've missed out on some of your favorites, so please in the comments below, make your arguments as why it should have been on this list. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, happy reefing.